Last time we learned that rhetoric was the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. It's the study of what makes something persuasion within a particular instance. We also learned that rhetoric is situational. We also learned about the rhetorical situation, which are all of the elements that surround and influence the creation of a text. The rhetorical situation has 6 elements: the writer, message, audience, context, exigence, and purpose. So the rhetorical situation dictates what is and is not persuasive. And this is based on the relationships we observe on the Aristotelian triangle. Where each of those elements intersect, there are constraints that arise that shape what the writer must do in order to effectively persuade. For instance, if we look at the top of the triangle, where the writer, message, and context intersect, we have the writer-message relationship. So based on who the writer is, what their message is, and the time and place they're writing in, there are certain constraints that come out of that shape what the writer does with the text. The same can be said for the lower right corner of the triangle, where the message, audience, and context intersect. Based on what the message is and who the audience are and the time and place they're hearing it, that also influences or shapes how a writer must deliver the text. Same with the lower left corner, that audience-writer relationship affected by context. Who the writer is, who the audience is, determines how they're going to hear that message. And so again, constraints arise out of those 3 intersection points. Rhetorical constraints, then, can be said to be those conditions of the rhetorical situation which shape the rhetoric of a text. It's all the stuff within the situation that influence the choices that a writer makes. And it can be helpful stuff or unhelpful stuff. Rhetorical constraints come in 2 forms. There are rhetorical obstacles, which are any conditions of the rhetorical situation which the writer must overcome in order to accomplish their purpose. And there are rhetorical advantages, which are any conditions of the rhetorical situation which help the writer accomplish their purpose. When examining rhetorical constraints, remember that the goal of all communication is to match speaker meaning with audience meaning. Rhetorical constraints, then, are those things that are affecting the audience's ability to receive that speaker meaning, whether they are things that are inhibiting that transaction or helping that transaction. To illustrate how rhetorical constraints work, watch this next video. And while you're watching, I just want you to think about what you see, and hopefully some of you will recognize it. Hopefully, some of you recognize this as the classic video game Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong is about a guy named Jumpman. No, that's not Mario. This is before Mario. His name is Jumpman. And Jumpman's girlfriend, whose name is Pauline, is kidnapped by a giant ape named Donkey Kong. And Donkey Kong takes Pauline to a construction site. That's what the levels are supposed to resemble. In the game, Jumpman has to climb the girders and beams, and in the later levels, the pulley systems, in order to get to Pauline. But every time he does so, Donkey Kong grabs her and takes her to a new part of the construction site. We could say that Jumpman has an exigence and a purpose. His exigence is that Donkey Kong has kidnapped Pauline and is holding her hostage at a construction site. Jumpman's purpose then is to rescue Pauline from Donkey Kong. And there are numerous constraints that the game gives us that shape how Jumpman can achieve his purpose. Writers of a text are a lot like Jumpman. Writers have a situation they're writing within. They must work within that situation in order to achieve their purposes. And along the way, they must overcome certain obstacles presented by their situation. And where possible, they must utilize whatever advantages the situation provides. Let's take a look now at some rhetorical constraints within a text. And for this, I want to look back at Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Think back to his rhetorical situation. Given what we've already studied about his situation, what then are some rhetorical obstacles that Martin Luther King Jr. faces within his situation? In other words, what are some of the conditions of his situation? That is, who he is, what his message is, who his audience is, when and where he is speaking. What are some of those elements that are making it difficult to achieve his particular purpose? Well, for one thing, we could say that his message may be disagreeable to some people in his audience. Remember, there's a lot of white supremacy in America, has been for a long time. So many in his audience, many listening, probably liked the way things were and didn't want to change the social order that placed white people in greater power over people of color. Another obstacle may be that his message may seem irrelevant to some in his audience. There are probably a lot of people listening that just don't have empathy toward the struggle of Black Americans because white people, to the white people listening, they don't go through the same thing that Black Americans had to go through. Another obstacle is perhaps this message may seem unrealistic to some in his audience. Black Americans have historically never been treated equally, and many may believe that the social hierarchy that places white people on top and people of color down below, maybe they believe that just cannot ever change, that there would always be too much opposition to actually fix this problem. Another obstacle would be that some in the audience just may not listen to King based on who he was. He was, after all, a hated public figure among conservatives at the time because he was proposing radical changes to the status quo in America. What about rhetorical advantages? Are there any advantages that Martin Luther King draws from within his situation? In other words, what are some of the conditions of his situation, who he is, what his message is, who his audience is, when and where he's speaking, that might be actively helping him achieve his purpose? Well, for one, his message is an inherently sympathetic one, at least to those people who believe Black people are people. And that's because his message is all about equality, and equality is a selfless and righteous thing to advocate for. It's also a big part of America's founding principles. And so on some level, to everybody listening, his message is inherently sympathetic. Of course, this calls into question how sympathetic it might be. Remember, some in his audience are racist and believe that Black people don't deserve the same sort of considerations that white people deserve, and so it's going to be sympathy, varying levels of sympathy. Another rhetorical advantage is that King himself is just an inherently sympathetic and admirable figure, unless, of course, you were one of the American conservatives at the time that felt directly threatened by him and his movement. But for everyone else, he's deeply sympathetic and admirable. He was a Southern minister, and so he has that kind of automatic virtue that comes with that position. He had, throughout his life, endured death threats, physical violence, police harassment, and yet here he is still speaking out on behalf of this movement he believes in. You may have noticed by now that all of the examples list more obstacles than advantages. And this is the way it should be. This is going to be the case in virtually all rhetorical situations. And that's because if there was ever a rhetorical situation that produced more advantages than obstacles, then there would be less of a need for the writer to actually write anything. So as a general rule, when analyzing the rhetorical situation of a persuasive text, look for more rhetorical obstacles than advantages. When interpreting rhetorical constraints, it may help to work through each intersection of the Aristotelian triangle. For instance, we could break down the rhetorical obstacles from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech based on the three intersection points. Let's start with the point that has the most listed under it, the message-audience relationship. And remember, all of these relationships are affected by context. But most of our obstacles came out of what the message is and who the audience is. And that just has a lot to do with the time and place, of course. Yeah, the fact that the audience may be unwilling or reluctant or may not feel empathetic, may not believe change is possible. That's the sort of thing that a predominantly white audience, which America was at the time, would have believed back in the early 60s. And so that is why there's more obstacles coming out of that relationship than at any other point in the triangle. Looking over at the audience-writer relationship, yeah, we do have a big obstacle there, the fact that the audience may not like King because there's those in the audience who hated him at the time. So that is a big obstacle as well. Looking up at the top point, though, we see that we are curiously missing any rhetorical obstacles pertaining to the writer-message relationship. And that makes sense. There's nothing really getting in the way of King achieving his purpose based on who he is and how that relates to his message. And that's because what he's speaking about is not something that is selfish. It's something that's selfless, benefiting everybody. What he's speaking about is inherently virtuous. It's not something that he benefits unfairly from. It's something that he's an expert on as well, having lived through all of these terrible ordeals that you lived through when you were black in America at this time. And so there's nothing really getting in his way there because he's speaking from a point of expertise and on a subject that he is all too familiar with and has a lot of credibility on. So when you're trying to interpret rhetorical constraints using the Aristotelian triangle, look at each of the three intersections and ask yourself these kinds of questions. How does one element affect the other two at that intersection? What key issues exist between these elements? What imbalances are present? And I know those are really big, broad questions, so I've actually created a list of relationship-specific questions and examples on the next slide. Make sure you download that for your handouts.